So hi, Dr. Austin. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you, Dr. Lewis?
Very good. Just so your audience doesn't know me, I'm a medical scientist, not an MD. So I have a PhD in chemistry and credentials from the Harvard School of Public Health. And I really study epidemiology, causes of disease, things like that. And I know you're really on top of this coronavirus, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
Great. Yeah, and I'd love to hear yours, particularly if you have some insight on the epidemiology. But this coronavirus, people are comparing it to SARS and MERS and Zika and the flu, and it's not any of those. This thing, it's a big deal, and if people should be concerned about this thing. This thing can replicate and spread during the asymptomatic phase. It can spread during the time people have symptoms, and it can spread when people are asymptomatic. And from an epidemiologic standpoint, this thing, there's studies, they're saying the R naught is anywhere from 2.5 to 3, and I've seen another study saying it's 4.08. And maybe you could tell our viewers what is an R naught. What does that mean from epidemiologic?
Well, I think I'm going to let you tell it because.
Okay. All right. So an R naught means that is how many people each person can spread the virus to. So an R naught of 4.08 means each person that is infected, on average, will spread the virus to over 4 other people. So this creates a huge issue from a public health standpoint, because in order to contain the spread of the virus, the public health departments would have to stop the spread and intercede on 80% of cases. And that is a very high bar from a public health standpoint to try to.
That's a very high number, particularly today where our chronic health burden is so high. And what that does is simply reflect the resilience of our population against these diseases. And that's the biggest problem. I mean, obviously, very young and very old are the most susceptible, but I have a little fact sheet here, Trent, which I'll put up on the screen. But basically, what we've seen in the coronavirus is that the median age of people are 49 to 56. It's not that old, so it's striking fairly healthy populations. Children are escaping the maximum damage because there's a presumption that their immune system, particularly the veracity of their white blood cells, leukocytes, neutrophils, lymphocytes, is greater than adults that have been immune systems corrupted by smoking, toxins, poor food, insulin resistance that makes us vulnerable. So these are the kinds of challenges we have in our population today compared to the past, where we're actually healthier. So I'd love to hear what you think some solutions are, some problems and solutions are.
Well, if we look at SARS, this virus is a coronavirus. So coronaviruses are very common, and they cause 20 to 30% of colds. So SARS and this novel coronavirus are just colds that happen to kill you. And what can Western medicine do for a cold? Nothing. I mean, we've been struggling to try to find the cure for the common cold for decades, and when we have failed, there's no vaccine. There's nothing. After the SARS epidemic, they tried to find Western medicines that were effective. They didn't find anything. They tried to develop a vaccine, and what they found with a lot of effort is that when you vaccinate animals against SARS and then expose them to the SARS virus, the ones who got the vaccine had a much higher mortality. The vaccination and then re-exposure to the wild virus induces a cytokine storm that greatly increases the incidence of the acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS, and that's what's killing people with this syndrome. So the novel coronavirus in many cases can, and particularly in children, will just be kind of a mild cold, kind of a fatigue and muscle aches. But in about 20% of cases, this thing progresses to a very serious critical illness that can progress to acute respiratory distress syndrome, which induces an inflammatory reaction in the lungs that gets out of control, and a leaking of fluids from the capillaries into the interstitial space and then on into the alveoli, where the lungs fill with fluid,
Right.
and inhibits the exchange of oxygen, and then people die. So these people that get the acute respiratory distress syndrome need to go on a ventilator until such time that either they recover or they die.
You sent me a bunch of interesting articles to different herbal remedies, since the antivirals and the vaccines don't exist. And the first one you sent me was on licorice roots. I know your expertise is in medicinal mushrooms particularly, but what do you know about licorice roots, and how would that be effective, or what have you seen from the studies on this?
Right. So, this novel coronavirus, we know of nothing from a Western medicine standpoint that helps. So what do we know from an herbal standpoint? Well, in Asia particularly, they did several studies where they screened herbal compounds against the SARS virus back in 2003.
Right.
And they found several things that from an in vitro standpoint or an animal standpoint could potentially be beneficial. So we're working with incomplete information here. So what do people do? I mean, you can do nothing. Which is what Western medicine has you do until such time you get sick enough you need to go on the ventilator, or you can do something. And if you're going to do something that's not been fully studied in humans in a double-blind placebo-controlled study, you want to choose something that's fairly safe.
Right.
And I talked in a video yesterday about elderberry syrup and how it can inhibit the replication in a broad range of viruses, including coronaviruses. And there's some in vitro studies and animal studies to back that up. But another herbal compound that was found that was very potent in terms of the inhibition of replication of SARS-associated coronaviruses was licorice root and the active compounds in licorice roots. So licorice root is fairly safe. It does have a few side effects. The main side effect that we need to be watching for is people with hypertension. It can, at high doses, long-term, raise blood pressure. So unfortunately, a lot of people do have high blood pressure, so this may not be a great option for them. But it's something that, you could take it and monitor your blood pressure and make sure that if the blood pressure starts to go up, then you can back off on the licorice root. But I think this may be a potential tool to have in the armory against this novel coronavirus is licorice root.
One of the other things that I've seen, and what we do with people that have HSV and Epstein-Barr, would be the olive leaf extract, and that is not that I'm plugging any company because I don't have any relationship with them, but Biobotanical Research has a substance they call, or a supplement they call Olivarix, which is the olive leaf extract that has pretty good evidence that it has antiviral activity. Do you have any experience with olive leaf extract as a?
I've been using it a little bit in people with hypertension, and its effects are mild. It seems to be very well tolerated. It's got a long history of safe use, right. And with these kind of viral things, what we know is that you can get a synergistic effect when you use more than one substance.
Oh, that makes total sense, right? It's never one thing. Thomas Borodi worked on the Nobel Prize-winning team for H. pylori, and he developed a triple antibiotic. One antibiotic couldn't do it, so it's never one thing. The other one I know, Dr. Austin, is that Tom Levy, he's the MD-JD, speaks about vitamin C, but it's very different than you have a pepper or cherries or citrus, but very high dose vitamin C. And these publications go back into the 1930s and 40s with Linus Pauling, of course, the only double Nobel Prize winner. But he's talking about 10 to 20 grams a day for a period of time to either do it strategically, or I know people are doing around 5 grams a day. Any comment on vitamin C? But anybody who's not sure, look up Thomas Levy, MD-JD, and watch some of his videos on what impact it has on influenza and other viruses. But are you using that at all in your practice?
Yeah, vitamin C is very safe, and I use it often when people have gum disease. It helps repair some of the gum disease. I use it in anybody who's diabetic and anybody who's overweight. They have a much higher need for vitamin C. The dosage I typically use is 1 gram twice a day. And the vitamin C, you can use it at high dosing. The main side effect would be diarrhea that can occur. Loose stools
Right.
can occur at higher dosing. So you kind of want to start at about 1 gram twice a day. And then if you're going to elevate the dosing, you want to ramp it up. But
That makes
certainly
a lot
there's
of
studies
sense.
that suggest that vitamin C can help with decreasing that inflammatory response and that cytokine storm that can be associated with the acute respiratory distress syndrome. So, if I had to and again, we're working with incomplete information. There may be there's multiple herbal compounds that may potentially be efficacious against inhibiting the replication of these SARS-associated coronaviruses. But right now, my plan for me is elderberry syrup to be used prophylactically and during the early stage of the illness. Licorice root to be used, when it becomes more endemic in our community and during the early stage and throughout the illness. Potentially olive leaf extract, vitamin C at moderate to high dosing. And then I am, I am a fan of the medicinal mushrooms
Absolutely.
and a mix of those. And there's several products out there, but typically what we see most commonly used is a mix of 6 medicinal mushrooms that include turkey tail, shiitake, maitake, cordyceps, and other mushrooms used together synergistically have a very profound antiviral effect against a broad range of viruses, but also can alter the body's cytokines in a beneficial way to both fight the virus and virus replication, but also reduce the inflammation that could be associated with the acute respiratory distress syndrome.
If I could add a couple more pragmatic solutions that affects, in this country, 25 million people. So it's a significant population, almost 10%, certainly of the adult population, is things like statin drugs that cause dysregulation of lipid transport, fat transport in your body, and fats are antibiotic. So a very recent study just came out with the so-called PCSK9 inhibitor, and up to 90% of the people on that in a trial had some sort of a adverse reaction. And unfortunately, the adverse reaction, let me just read it and I'll put it up on the screen, is more influenza, more upper respiratory tract infection and headache. But, so when you're talking about a deadly cold that affects the respiratory tract, and these drugs are making you more susceptible to infection there, can only extrapolate, I don't know for sure, but extrapolate and say that these drugs and all the LDL lipid lowering drugs that kind of cause the same thing, increase, they may lower cardiovascular mortality, but they don't lower overall mortality because it's more respiratory and cancer deaths associated with these drugs. So I'd say these are a bad deal when you have a aggressive viral situation like we have with the coronavirus. What is your take on that?
Yes, the cholesterol is an innate part of the immune system.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, the cholesterol lowering medications are proven to reduce a chance of a second heart attack in males who've had a previous heart attack. The data, but I don't believe they do so through their cholesterol lowering effects. I think they do so through their anti-inflammatory effects, but they come at a cost. They lower inflammation at a great cost of, they poison the mitochondria in the muscles, and they cause a higher mortality from other causes, including cancers. They raise the risk of diabetes in women. They have a whole huge set of downsides. So in my practice, I counsel people about what standard of care is regarding statins, and then we try to lower cardiovascular risk by lowering inflammation through other methods, many of which I've learned from you.
The whole point is we're trying to reduce susceptibility and risk. and it's a multi-leg stool, and the side effects from the medications. I watched 60 Minutes to find out what the drug companies are pushing as the big drugs du jour, and it's all the biologics. And every single one of those advertisements, and if you look at the safety flyer, says, tell your doctor if you have an infection. What does it mean? It means that these drugs will downregulate inflammation specifically to overcome like psoriasis or rheumatoid arthritis pain and effects. But ultimately, it's suppressing your immune system and making you more vulnerable. So something like SARS, something like coronavirus, when you look at the people who are dying from it, they're more vulnerable people, and that's up on the slide. So you're taking a biologic drug because you have a little inconvenient skin rash, which really is emanating from your gut. That drug is making you more susceptible to dying or getting severely sick from influenza and SARS and obviously coronavirus as it spreads throughout the world.
Another thing that I think should be considered for people right now is vitamin D. Vitamin D deficiency, particularly here in the Midwest, is rampant. And vitamin D is critical for many different bodily functions, but immune system is one of those. People who are deficient in vitamin D have a much higher incidence of autoimmune disorders and infections. So, before the coronavirus comes to your area, you might want to get your vitamin D level up to where it needs to be.
Right. Dr. Barodi, I mentioned him before, he developed a triple antibiotic for H. pylori. Part of the Nobel Prize team on H. pylori and stomach ulcers said that for neutrophils to work properly, you have to have elevated levels of vitamin D. And the problem we have in the standard of care is that the vitamin D levels, and first of all, we know it's a hormone, not a vitamin, are set for bone health, not for anti-infective. So you need to be at least at 2, maybe 3 times what the standard of care recommends, which is around 60 to 80 nanograms per milliliter. And I'm not a prescriber, but the rule of thumb is if you want to get to 60 to 80, you have to take around 10,000 IU of vitamin D a day, or get some sun to bring it up. And it's not about how much you take, it's what is your blood level.
Right, and a lot of people don't absorb the vitamin D well, or any other fat-soluble vitamins, because they have gut absorption issues and they're eating a diet that's too high in these carbs, the wheat and the sugar, and that inhibits the absorption of vitamin D. If you want to absorb vitamin D, you have to take it with a fatty meal.
And you have to have, you can't be suppressing LDL production, because LDL is a soap that carries fat-soluble things like vitamin D through our water-based bloodstream. So you have to have the LDL. The liver produces it for a reason. So all these things are critical.
Do you want to tell you what, this coronavirus has me, I'll be honest, I'm kind of usually pretty calm. But I think, this coronavirus, when the government comes out and says not to panic, that's the time when you should be panicking. This thing is, we're seeing just the tip of the iceberg. This thing, because it spreads, I think we should work under the assumption it will not be contained there, and look at the people in Wuhan, what they wish they'd have had if they knew this thing was coming. Number one, all these people live in the cities, wish they'd have had about 3 months of food, because you can ride this thing out if you don't have to leave your house. You can hunker down until this thing will go. We'll get through this, just like we always have all the other disasters in our history. But it's not going to be easy, and you don't want to, you don't want to starve to death, or you don't want to expose yourself to the virus by having to go out to the store every week. Right now is the time to lay up a little supply of enough things, anticipate what you would need, and lay it up now. And I'll tell you, the viewers, just last week, the 2 largest suppliers of long-term food storage in the United States, I won't mention the names, but they were sold out of stock of everything. So there are a few people who can see the same thing I see, who are making plans. And once everybody realizes what's happening, it's going to be too late to make preparations, just like it is in Wuhan. Once they shut off the city and they shut off the shipping, and everything shuts down, and you got to ride this thing out, you better be prepared.
So you're talking canned goods. One thing I work with a lot of road warriors, so I'm always working on getting them foods that'll last a while. Like the canned fish and things like that. They're very protective of your health, the anti-inflammatory, but also very long lived, very long shelf life. So potatoes, rice, root vegetables, canned foods, things like that are what we have in large supply in our home.
Yeah, canned foods make sense. And you can have, they can last for a very long time, years. Dried beans and rice, if stored in Mylar bags with oxygen absorbers, can have a shelf life up to 30 years.
Right.
So they're not the tastiest always, but that's and we're not going to need 30 years here. We're going to, this thing. It's hard to predict, but I don't see it peaking really till about April or May, and then the coronaviruses. They replicate better in cool, dry weather. When the weather gets warm and wet, they don't do as well. So they tend to kind of peter out in the summer. But then we can certainly have a resurgence. Just like we saw with the Spanish flu, that thing lasted over a couple seasons, and we had about 3 different waves of it. So nobody's been around through a major pandemic. Everybody, who was alive during the Spanish.
Been a while. Let me point out another medicinal that is not well appreciated, but I have some people that say you stay away from fish oil, but fish oil, particularly cod liver oil, has a 1,000-year history of curing chronic disease. And it was in the mid-1800s when there was a consumption epidemic, which is tuberculosis so bad you're spitting blood from your lungs. And survivorship from that disease in British hospitals was 6%. But when people were on high-dose cod liver oil, and we're talking between 50 and 45 grams, so you want to convert grams to capsules, it's 1 for 1. So if you want to take 1 gram, it's 1 capsule. So 15 to 45 grams reduced in-hospital mortality of end-stage consumption by 300%. Now, it wasn't super dramatic, so only 6% were surviving. But then in the cod liver oil cohort, 18% were surviving. So that's significant. And I can guarantee you that was not a very pure cod liver oil back then. It was probably, had some odor and rancidity compared to the pristine products that we have available on our shelves today. So, and the reason why it works, it's not just the fish oils, but cod liver oil is high in both vitamin D and vitamin A, along with other fat-soluble vitamins. So it's highly medicinal from a multifactorial perspective. So that's what our family does. It's great for the brain, but it's just great for overall health. So we're we're protecting ourselves with a lot of fish, cod liver oil, high-dose vitamin C, prophylactically kind of making sure our vitamin D levels are up at the 60 to 80 nanograms per milliliter level, things of that nature.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of cod liver oil, and you want to be eating a good, clean, healthy diet when there's a worldwide pandemic.
Right.
You don't want to be eating junk food. You don't want to be smoking. You want to do everything you can to keep yourself healthy. And I look forward to. I'm learning. And this thing is evolving as we go. So we're working with incomplete information, but I look forward to doing some more videos about some additional herbal compounds that for which there is some data against the SARS virus, and that's what we have to go with. This coronavirus is most like the SARS virus, which was also a coronavirus, and that's what we have to go with. We have to work with.
But Dr. Austin, let me give a plug, and I know you're doing pretty much the same thing. We have developed a blood test panel that is not based on the standard of care reference intervals. It's based on an increase in mortality. So we call it the chronic disease temperature. And I believe if you have an elevated chronic disease temperature, you're the one who's more likely to die from something like coronavirus. So working with a doctor like yourself or my coaching team or some of the doctors on my team to bring down your chronic disease temperature is the way you protect yourself against the flu, against the cold, against disease and chronic diseases in general. So I believe there is a way, importantly, to measure an individual's susceptibility to these conditions. Obviously, risk factors like age and smoking, body mass index, and all those traditional things are valuable measures. But objective measures through blood testing, I believe, is a superior way to differentiate those at low risk and those at high risk. And the beautiful thing about the measurements we do is they're all modifiable. Elevated white blood cells, elevated C-reactive protein, elevated erythrocyte sedimentation rate. All these things are modifiable down in your favor if they're detected to be out of range and severely out of range. So with that,
I'm a believer, and I've implemented a lot of what I've learned in working with you into my practice, and I see results. People who do what I say often get better. I've seen people who are cured of their rheumatoid arthritis. I've seen people with diabetes who are no longer diabetic. They're off their, type 2 diabetes. They're off their insulin.
Sure.
They're off their metformin. Their diabetes is gone if they implement these changes. It's been miraculous in many cases. So
change is the key thing. So Dr. Austin, hey, great talking to you. Let's do another one of these soon.
Yes.
And hope the audience finds this of value. But obviously, if they're concerned, you run a natural medicine practice, and you can obviously help people bolster their immunity, and that's what it's all about.
I'm happy. I like helping people. I really do.
All right, my friend. We'll talk soon.